Today's topic is an important one for any multinational company. The Trump administration has made clear that it will use the threat of high U.S. tariffs as a means of reordering international trading patterns. Longstanding assumptions, such as that low tariffs are guaranteed with countries operating under free trade agreements like the USMCA, are being called into question. As a result, companies that source abroad need to thoroughly examine their supply chains and suppliers, look to work in supplier flexibility and alternative suppliers, and risk plan various scenarios to help them weather international trade turbulence, including potential rapid changes in tariff rates. One aspect of this is for companies to understand how their contractual terms may, or may not, protect them from tariff-related risks. You may think you're covered under your contract provisions, but unless you have specific tariff-related provisions in your supply and sell side contracts, you probably are not. Our presentation today breaks down some common contractual provisions to indicate the best way for you to manage your company's tariff-related risks in these turbulent times.
Frequently asked question number 1, can I declare force majeure? The answer depends on what's in your contract. If the contracts expressly mention who bears risk for increased tariffs, then it's possible. However, it's unlikely. Most contracts do not. That said, during Trump Tariff 1.0, many sellers used a force majeure provision that had general language like circumstances beyond our reasonable control to at least bring buyers back to the negotiating table. There's also a default provision under law called commercial impracticability. A lot of sellers have asked, can we rely on that, unforeseen circumstances that have arisen that have made it excessively burdensome to perform? The answer again is likely no. Courts have denied those claims time and time again for tariffs for incredibly burdensome cost increases because they deem those foreseeable.
FAQ number 2, if force majeure doesn't help, what other provisions of the contract might protect me? Look first to see, are there tariff-specific provisions? Probably not. Most contracts do not include the term tariff or address which party bears the risk in absorbing tariffs that were not in effect at the time the parties entered into their agreement. So what about the terms taxes or duties? Most contracts do reference taxes or duties, and most courts have found that tariffs are really similar and just another form of taxes or duties. So if the contract contemplates that the price is inclusive of all taxes, duties, and imports, this can be a good leverage point in your negotiations with your supply contract partner. If the contract includes a fixed price pricing provision that expressly states that the price is inclusive of all taxes, duties, and imports, then the buyer will be able to point to this provision to claim that the seller took on the risk of future tariffs. For contracts that contain a pricing index provision, there may be a way for you to revisit pricing once with your partner and seek price increases as a result of the tariffs. So look at your contracts to determine whether there are options for outright renegotiating. Even if there are not, most companies still are planning to engage in commercial negotiations with their supply contract partners. Some companies are actually looking to see whether there is an opportunity to outright terminate for convenience their contracts if they're no longer going to be profitable, or at least looking to reject future orders or additional releases in contracts where there is an opportunity to do so. Finally, and very importantly, look at your Incoterms. Incoterms define which party is responsible for tariffs, duties, and transportation costs. So for example, many automotive contracts specify that the seller is going to cover export costs and the buyer will cover import costs, making Incoterms a useful starting point, just a starting point for tariff responsibility. Some additional common Incoterms you may see that may impact responsibility for tariffs are Ex Works, EXW, buyer bears all costs, including tariffs, DDP, delivered duty paid. There, the seller would assume all import duties and tariffs. And then free on board, which responsibility would depend on the shipment location and the agreed upon terms. So the bottom line is manufacturing companies are using their contracts and some of these provisions as the starting point to engage their supply contract partners in commercial negotiations regarding the impact of the tariffs and which party is going to bear responsibility.
Frequently asked question number 3. Okay, so my current contract doesn't protect me. As I'm entering into new contracts, what provisions can I put in place to protect myself in the future? Well, for starters, as a seller, You can enter into non-fixed pricing so that as costs rise, you can continue to ask for different pricing. You could also include a provision that expressly says who bears the risk of increased tariffs. You can do this through a provision that addresses it directly or through Incoterms, as Vanessa discussed. You could also include what I would consider sort of a nuclear option, that if tariffs are imposed, then the seller can impose an equitable price change on the buyer, and if the buyer does not accept it, the seller can terminate. This at least gives the seller an opportunity to get out of the contract if it gets upside down on its pricing. On the buy side, you might consider including a provision in the force majeure clause that expressly clarifies that if increased costs like tariff occur, that can't be the basis for declaring force majeure. This will help cut off that as a negotiating tactic down the road.